Get ready to dive into one of the most impactful and disturbing stories in the Bible. In today's video, we'll talk about the tragic narrative of a Levite and his concubine, whose fates intersect with the depravity of Gibeah. This story brings to light the devastating events that led to a civil war between the tribes of Israel and the profound consequences of this struggle. Through a detailed narrative, you will see how the quest for justice and the fight against evil can both unite and divide a nation. Come with me on this journey that reveals the harsh lessons of injustice and cowardice of a people steeped in sin and estranged from God. Subscribe to this channel and leave your like on this video so I know that this content is relevant to you. That said, let's get down to business. Our story begins at a time of chaos and disorder in Israel, when everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. In a small town in the hills of Ephraim, there lived a Levite, a member of the tribe in charge of taking care of religious services and the temple. This Levite had a concubine, a woman he loved, but who one day decided to run away to her father's house in Bethlehem of Judah. The Levite, missing his companion and determined to bring her back, embarked on a long journey to look for his concubine. When he finally arrived at his father-in-law's house, he was warmly welcomed. The young woman's father, pleased to see his son-in-law, insisted that they stay there for a few days. Day after day, the father-in-law convinced them to stay, offering hospitality and generosity. After several days of insistence, the Levite decided it was time to leave. He and his concubine, now reconciled, began their journey home. Accompanied by a servant and a few donkeys loaded with supplies, they made their way along the ancient and dusty roads of Israel. As the sun began to set, the small group approached the city of Gibeah, which would later be known as Jerusalem. The servant suggested they stop there for the night, but the Levite refused. Gibeah was inhabited by Jebusites, a foreign people, and he feared for the safety of his entourage in a city where he knew no one. Determined to find a safe place, the Levite continued his journey to the Israelite city of Gibeah, in the land of the tribe of Benjamin. They arrived in Gibeah at dusk and made their way to the town square, hoping to find someone to take them in for the night. However, the square became emptier and emptier and no one offered them shelter. Finally, an old man coming in from the fields after a long day's work saw the Levite and his group in the square. With a hospitable spirit, the old man asked them where they came from and where they were going. The Levite explained his situation, mentioning that he needed a safe place to spend the night. The old man, realizing their need and the dangers of the night, offered them shelter in his house. The Levite, his concubine, and the servant were warmly welcomed by the old man. He led them to his house, making sure their donkeys were fed and providing a meal for his guests. Finally, the Levite felt relieved, believing that he and his concubine were safe among his own people in the land of Benjamin. However, little did they know that this night, which seemed peaceful and safe, would be the beginning of one of the darkest and most tragic chapters in Israel's history. A group of wicked men, sons of Belial, surrounded the old man's house. They pounded on the door, demanding that the Levite be handed over to them to be abused. These men were merciless and full of evil, ready to commit atrocities. The old man went out to confront the crowd, pleading with them not to commit such an abominable crime. He begged them to respect the laws of hospitality and protection, arguing that the Levite was his guest, and that this violation would be a great injustice. However, the men did not back down in their demands. The Levite, in an act of desperation and self-preservation, gives his concubine to the wicked men of Gibeah. The night turns into an unimaginable nightmare as the men cruelly abuse her, ignoring her cries and pleas for mercy. Violence and brutality know no bounds, and the night seems to stretch on forever for the poor woman. As the night progresses, the concubine's tragedy unfolds with disturbing intensity. Every moment is a battle for survival, a struggle against the pain and suffering inflicted by those who should have been her brothers. The darkness of the night hides the evil of men, but their repulsive acts bear witness to their depravity. Finally, dawn begins to break, bringing with it a fragile hope of relief. With the first light of day, the exhausted and badly wounded concubine finds the strength to get up. In faltering steps, she heads back to the old man's house, her last desperate attempt to find safety and comfort. Her journey back is marked by every heavy step, every movement a painful reminder of the night before. When she arrives at the old man's house, the concubine collapses in front of the door. Her hands reach out in a final gesture of seeking help, but her body can no longer bear the weight of her suffering. There, on the threshold of the door, she meets her tragic end. Her death is a silent witness to the violence and evil she has suffered. When the Levite opens the door the next morning, he finds his concubine lying motionless. The sight of his now lifeless companion is a devastating blow. The reality of his loss and the brutality of what happened during the night hit him full force. Horror and sadness mix in a whirlwind of emotions, leaving the Levite stunned and desperate. This event marks the point of greatest pain and tragedy in the narrative. The concubine's death is irrefutable proof of the depravity that has taken hold of Gibeah and serves as a catalyst for the events that will follow. The Levite, overcome by grief and indignation, decides that this act of brutality cannot go unpunished. The concubine's tragic death will not be in vain. Her story of suffering and injustice will echo throughout Israel, uniting the tribes in a cry for justice. The collective outrage resulting from this barbaric act will trigger a series of events that will change the course of Israel's history, as the nation unites to confront the wickedness within its own borders. Shocked and devastated by the brutal death of his concubine, the Levite finds himself immersed in a maelstrom of pain and indignation. The sight of the lifeless body of the woman he loved, lying before the old man's door, is an image that will remain etched in his memory forever. The injustice and evil she suffered at Gibeah cannot be forgotten, and he feels an urgent need to seek justice. Seized by a mixture of grief and fury, the Levite decides to take an extreme action, something that will attract the attention of the entire nation of Israel. He takes the body of his concubine and, in an act of desperation and determination, cuts it into 12 parts. Each part is sent to one of the tribes of Israel, accompanied by a message describing the horror that took place at Gibeah. This horrible and shocking act arouses a cry of indignation throughout Israel. When the 12 tribes receive the body parts, they are confronted with the brutal reality of what has happened. The Levite's act serves as a cry for help, an urgent call for the whole nation to rise up against the wickedness and depravity that had taken hold of Gibeah. The news spreads quickly, and the tribes of Israel gather in Mizpah to discuss the terrible injustice committed. The assembly is overwhelmed by a sense of revolt and a desire for justice. The leaders of each tribe listen to the Levite's story with horror and disbelief, and the consensus is unanimous. Something must be done to punish the guilty and restore justice to Israel. The collective indignation is palpable. The tribal leaders argue intensely, aware that to allow such evil to go unanswered would be to accept the disintegration of the values that sustain their society. The demand is clear. The tribe of Benjamin must hand over the men responsible for the crime at Gibeah so that they can be tried and punished, but Benjamin's tribe refuses to cooperate. They feel attacked and, in an act of pride and stubbornness, choose to protect the criminals among them. This decision puts the entire nation of Israel on alert. Benjamin's refusal is seen as a challenge to collective authority and a threat to the unity and justice that the tribes strive to maintain. The situation quickly turns into a preparation for war. The tribes of Israel arm themselves and organize themselves to confront their own brothers in Benjamin. The indignation over the concubine's death, symbolized by the parts of her body sent throughout the country, fuels a burning desire for justice and the purification of the land of Israel from the wickedness that had crept in. This outcry and the subsequent preparation for conflict mark a critical point in Israel's history. The Levites' desperate act, though extreme, succeeded in uniting the nation in a common purpose: to restore justice and eradicate the wickedness that threatened to destroy the peace and integrity of their communities. The coming war will be fierce and devastating, but for the tribes of Israel, it is a necessary step to protect the fundamental values of their society. Delving a little deeper into the assembly before we talk about the war, representatives of all the tribes, from the elders to the warriors, converge on this city, determined to discuss the terrible crime and seek justice. The central square of Mizpah buzzes with activity, and the heated voices of the Israelites, all united by a common goal: to punish those responsible for the brutal death of the Levite's concubine. The assembly is marked by fiery and emotional speeches. The leaders of the tribes speak of the need to maintain justice and righteousness in Israel, condemning the savage act that took place at Gibeah. They emphasize that to allow such evil to go unpunished would be to erode the values and integrity of God's people. There is a general consensus that firm and decisive action is needed. After much deliberation, the tribes of Israel agree to send emissaries to the tribe of Benjamin, demanding that the men responsible for the crime be handed over to be tried and punished. This demand is clear and direct, an attempt to solve the problem without resorting to violence. The emissaries set off for Benjamin, carrying with them the hope of a peaceful resolution. However, the response of the tribe of Benjamin is firm and inflexible. The tribe refuses to hand over the guilty men, choosing instead to protect them in an act of tribal solidarity that, in Israel's eyes, is an insult to justice. Benjamin's refusal is not only a defense of the criminals, but also a direct challenge to the authority and unity of the other tribes. The indignation of the tribes of Israel turns into determination. They realize that Benjamin's refusal means there is no other option but war. With heavy but resolute hearts, preparations begin for a conflict that will be devastating. Civil war is a painful decision, but one that is seen as necessary to cleanse the land of Israel of the wickedness that has taken root in Gibeah. The leaders of the tribes organize their forces, gathering warriors from all over the country. The number of men prepared for battle is immense, reflecting the gravity of the purpose that unites them. The preparations are meticulous, from the distribution of weapons to the formation of combat strategies. Each tribe contributes its best, knowing that they are about to face their own brothers. The troops march towards Benjamin's territory, an army united by indignation and the desire for justice. The tension is palpable as they approach Gibeah, the scene of the crime that sparked the conflict. The forces of Israel are positioning themselves, ready for the confrontation that will define the future of their nation. This internal conflict, which we will detail below, has devastating consequences, not only in terms of lives lost, but also in the emotional and spiritual impact on the people of Israel. The nation, which was once united by its faith and purpose, is now divided and scarred by a deep wound, and most importantly, a people who have completely turned away from the Lord. The war between Israel and Benjamin is fierce and devastating. The battles that follow are intense and cruel, marked by a brutality that no one had anticipated. The battlefields are filled with war cries, the clang of swords and the sound of galloping horses. The forces of Israel, numerically superior, advance against the Benjamites with a fury fueled by the search for justice and the memory of the murdered concubine. The Benjamites' resistance is fierce. They fight with the courage of those who are defending not only their lives, but also their homes and families. Each battle is a test of courage and endurance, but the numerical disadvantage is insurmountable. The losses on both sides are heavy, but the tragedy is particularly severe for the tribe of Benjamin. As the days go by, the war becomes a series of bloody confrontations that result in the near annihilation of the tribe of Benjamin. The Benjamite warriors fall in great numbers, their defenses are broken, and their cities are devastated. When the dust finally settles, only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin remain alive. These survivors, with heavy hearts and hope almost extinguished, flee into the desert, seeking refuge in the rocks of Rimmon. The devastation of the tribe of Benjamin is a deep wound in the nation of Israel. The victory is bitter, for the price paid is immeasurable. The tribes of Israel, who were once united in their indignation and desire for justice, now find themselves facing the reality of the destruction of one of their own. The pain of loss and the weight of responsibility fall on everyone. After the conflict, the people of Israel mourn the destruction of their Benjamite brothers. There is a deep sense of sadness and regret, a recognition that although justice was sought, the cost was terribly high. The tribes come together again, this time not to plan for war but to look for ways to help the survivors rebuild their lives. In an effort at reconciliation and restoration, Israel takes steps to ensure the survival of the tribe of Benjamin. They take an oath not to give their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites, but they also recognize the need to preserve the tribe. To avoid total extinction, they find a creative and controversial solution. They decide to allow the 600 surviving Benjamites to take wives from among the young women of Jabesh Gilead. a town that had not taken part in the assembly at Mizpah. This solution, although imperfect, offers an opportunity for the tribe of Benjamin to rebuild. The surviving Benjamites slowly return from their exile in the desert, carrying the weight of loss and bitter memories, but also a spark of hope. Rebuilding is a long and difficult process, but over time, the tribe begins to get back on its feet. War and its consequences leave an indelible mark on Israel's history. The tragedy of Gibeah, the civil war, and the near extinction of Benjamin are painful reminders of the dangers of injustice and violence. The story also serves as a testimony to Israel's ability to recognize its mistakes, seek reconciliation, and work together for restoration. The big problem with all this is the people's estrangement from their Lord. Remember that. This bitter and reflective ending is a profound lesson in the importance of justice, compassion, and unity. The nation of Israel emerges from this period of darkness with a renewed understanding of its identity and purpose, committed to preventing such tragedies from recurring in the future. It is important to point out that this story takes place because the people of Israel had turned away from the Lord and His commandments. Therefore, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what they wanted in those days. This story is a representation of the sin that resides in our hearts and the human perversity that lives far from its Creator. Both the tribes of Israel and the cowardly act of the Levite demonstrate what humanity is when it lives far from God's precepts. May this story make you think and realize that a life without God is a life of despair, seasoned with injustice and cruelty. This is what sin has done to mankind. May God have mercy on us. Leave your like on this video and your opinion in the comments on what you learned today. See you in the next video.